like to think of as Jimmy Stewart Corner. And it's not because Jimmy Stewart really ever did anything here, but because from this corner you can see all the Jimmy Stewart sites in town. That we're here. Of course we can see the Jimmy Stewart statue with his rendition from Mr. Smith Goes to Washington that was put up in the 1980s on the courthouse lawn. You can see Jimmy Stewart's house, or at least his parents' house, that Dutch colonial house up there with a gambrel roof. Is where his parents lived, and if you've ever read any Jimmy Stewart biography, the thing about it is when people are alive, they have a lot to say and they write a lot, and we're sick of hearing them. But then they die, and within 20, 30 years, there's scant little left of them. It's a name on a tombstone, and what survives is what you wrote. It's not what you do that survives, it's what is written that survives. So for all of you people with one foot in the grave, write it down now. Write it down now. Because once you're gone, it's gone. I mean, after people forget the stories, I can't imagine how my children are going to mangle my stories if I don't write it down. So that in the Jimmy Stewart, now that he's dead, there are the Jimmy Stewart biographies always cite the same stories of his childhood, the same stories, because those are the stories that he wrote down. And when you read them, it seemed like a lot at the time when he was alive and nobody cared. But now that he's dead, it's like, I wish there was more. I wish there was more. He tells the story of waking up when was he born?
1909?
What was the president? Was the president that died in office? Was it McKinley? Is he that old? Sure, McKinley.
No, he does.
There's a story of him and his father waking him up early one morning, and because one of the presidents, I'm thinking it was McKinley. Who else died back then? And he was a little boy, and the president's death train was going. If it was McKinley, it was going back to Ohio. And him and his father got in the car and they drove about 50 miles to the place where that train was going, and they put pennies on the track. And when that death train came over, the pennies were squashing it, and he always kept that penny as a souvenir of that time period. And that's a great story. It's a story of him building an airplane and trying to fly the airplane off the roof of his house. That's a great story. That's the roof. And that's the roof. And so we see these stories that can tie to places, and from this corner, we can tie those places together and see them. If we crane our necks, we can almost see the steps to his house where he was born. That's now where the funeral parlor is down there on West Village. You can almost see the steps. The last thing of the house where he was born. Where his father was part of that working class. They lived in a lot of house out there, but eventually he comes to own the place. And they were nothing for the change in the sound of the family. They always say, they always made it sound like Jimmy Stewart came from this sort of humble beginnings where his dad just owns a hardware store in a small town in Pennsylvania. But it wasn't just a hardware store. I mean, this was one of the substantial businesses in town that this whole entire block. It was a hardware store, emporium, and everything else. To feed and seed, and it took things off the railroad and sold it to farmers, and so it was a major significant operation that was right here. The Stewarts are a big family in the 19th century. They fall apart in the 20th century because people just basically die out and move away. But they were here at the beginning, in the early 19th century, throughout the 19th century. There's Stewarts everywhere. His grandfather started the business. His grandfather was in it with his brother, and Jimmy Stewart's uncles and father took over the business. So it went on for generations. And their story is now written where? At the cemetery. You go out to Greenlawn, and it's just a cluster of Stewarts. And that family was a big family. It came here, rose, it expanded, it died out, and they're all in the cemetery now, where we can see the end of their story. The story